Hello, and welcome to a recap of this session, The Incomes and Outcomes of Low-Wage Work, the Minimum Wage and Beyond, originally presented as a morning workshop session at our PA Budget Summit, Thursday, April 27, 2023. This summit, themed Bridging Divisions, Advancing Common Goals for the Commonwealth, was put on by the Pennsylvania Budget and Policy Center and Keystone Research Center in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. The workshop description shown here lays out the path we'll take in this presentation, analyzing Governor Shapiro's proposal to raise the Pennsylvania minimum wage, exploring messaging and myths, and highlighting some other issues that impact low-wage workers. This session was presented by myself and my two colleagues. My name is Claire Kovach, and I'm the Senior Research Analyst at the Keystone Research Center. We started off the session with a quote here. This is a quote from President Franklin D. Roosevelt, our 32nd president, who assumed the presidency at the depth of the Great Depression. He gave the statement in a 1933 speech on the National Industrial Recovery Act when the original minimum wage law was passed. At its creation, the minimum wage aimed to stabilize a post-depression economy while protecting workers who had very little or no bargaining power. It was set to create a minimum standard of living for the lowest paid workers, aiming to protect their health and well-being. And that's not just my take, that's from Cornell Law School's overview of the Fair Labor Standards Act. But the United States was far from the first country to institute a minimum wage. New Zealand was actually the first country to implement minimum wage law in 1894. Some early minimum wage laws were considered as a temporary measure, sometimes targeting women and children's working protection. In the early 1900s, there was widespread concern about sweatshops in the United States, in particular about working conditions for women and children. Minimum wage laws were first introduced at the state level and in most cases only applied to them. State minimum wage laws were very regularly challenged in courts, and in 1923, the U.S. Supreme Court declared minimum wages to be unconstitutional. In 1938, following an initiative by President Roosevelt, the U.S. Congress adopted the Fair Labor Standards Act, which instituted a federal minimum wage. Its constitutionality was almost immediately challenged in courts, but it was eventually validated by the Supreme Court in 1941. After World War II, coverage of the minimum wage expanded in many countries across the world to include other workers as a protection against low wages. In recent years, minimum wage systems have been established or strengthened in many countries, specifically to address poverty and inequality experienced by working folks. And that's largely the conversational context we see around the minimum wage in the U.S. today, conversations about minimum standards of living. But not everyone believes there even should be a minimum wage. This section was presented by Mason Murtaza, who highlighted some common economic arguments against and for a minimum wage. One of the most common of which is that the market should set the wage, and if a job doesn't pay a living wage, people just won't do it. This argument is hinged on the idea that people have full information, that they have a superior understanding of things like their budget and how much emergencies cost, and how often they should expect to experience emergencies, that they know and compare how much they get paid to all other jobs in their area. And I guess anyone who has recently been applying to jobs or knows someone who has, all too well that it's nearly impossible to compare wages across different job postings. Most of the time you can have a general idea of what the pay for the role might be, but you might not even find out to the interview or a job offer what the actual pay rate is. And that's just one of the many issues with letting the market establish its own minimum. You're going to have wild variation in areas with little transportation infrastructure and those with solid public transportation. You're going to have huge, even inter-community differences in pricing for the same type of job. Many employers pretty safely guard wage and salary information. There's a reason why it's illegal to fire someone or retaliate against workers for talking about their wage. But I also bet there are people listening to this presentation who have been told that it's rude or inappropriate to discuss how much they might earn. You may even know someone who's been retaliated against after they were caught discussing their wages. So people ultimately don't have perfect information. They don't have perfect information about how much value their labor produces. They don't always know how productive they are or how they are compensated for that productivity. For decades, up until the 1980s, a worker's productivity and their compensation were pretty closely tied together. They tracked each other nearly perfectly. But something happened in the 1980s, and these two diverged. Workers produced more and more than they ever had, but their wages only crept up a little bit. Productivity and compensation ultimately, split. So some of this productivity increase has a lot to do with the technological increases of the time. I'm working here on a computer. I work on it daily, and it makes me productive in ways that were unheard of, 40 or 50 years ago. But this isn't why compensation stagnated. Before the 1980s, compensation tracked productivity closely because specific policies were adopted with the intentional goal of spreading the benefits of growth broadly across income classes. The Economic Policy Institute, who put together this chart, they've done some great research on this divergence, because starting in the late 1970s, policymakers began dismantling so many policy supports that helped to ensure that workers' wages grew with productivity. So excess unemployment was tolerated, they said, to keep inflation in check. There was growing employer hostility toward unions, and the labor law didn't keep up. Tax rates on top incomes were lowered. The trucking and airline industries were deregulated, and among the push for other anti-worker policy, raises in the federal minimum wage became smaller and rarer. So today, federally in the United States, the minimum wage is $7.25, and effectively in Pennsylvania, it's $7.25. Although I believe on the books, it's actually a little bit lower, but we were preempted by the federal minimum wage law. So here's a map here showing our state neighbors in the minimum wage as of the beginning of this year, 2023. So it's important to note a few things. Several of these neighbor states have special circumstances to pay for certain workers. So in New York statewide, all fast food workers get paid a minimum wage of $15 per hour, and they have been getting paid that since 2021. So their state law allows for separate minimum wage rates for New York City and some downstate counties. Maryland is similar. Montgomery County, Maryland, sort of between Baltimore and Washington, D.C., right north of Washington, D.C. Their minimum wage is $15.65. And so this map will soon be out of date if it isn't already in some areas by the time you watch this. Washington, D.C. is scheduled to increase to $17 this July. New York, Maryland, and Delaware are all scheduled to increase, I believe, 2 more times before mid-2025. So this ultimately brings us to the proposal. In Governor Shapiro's first budget address, he included the language, which I have the citation for the actual budget line there. Effective January 1st, 2024, an increase in the minimum wage from $7.25 per hour to $15 per hour is proposed. So we pause here for a short activity. Participants in the room were asked to take a few minutes to discuss and write down some responses they've heard to calls for a higher minimum wage. Support they're hearing for it, also some pushback. The workshop attendees had some great ideas, and they hit a lot of these that I'll go through in the next slide. Some of the common myths that we hear a lot are that only teens will benefit from the minimum wage increase, or that the people working these jobs don't need the money, they're just working for pocket change. We hear calls that, if we raise the minimum wage, everything will just cost more and we'll be back to right where we are now. We hear that raising the minimum wage hurts businesses, or particularly small businesses. And more lately, we've heard pretty broad support for the idea that the minimum wage does need raised, but we're hearing far too often that $15 is just too much. So we're going to unpack some of these myths here. Number 1, only teenagers will benefit. Often this is coupled with, the quote, only teenagers flipping burgers are going to get a raise. But Keystone Research Center estimates of who would benefit under the governor's proposal show that only 14% of those who benefit are teenagers. The Pennsylvania teenage workforce is around 236,000 teens. And using census data, and we do some quick math here, that's the ball game. Teenagers are far from the only, or even far from the majority of people who would benefit from this proposal. Next up, we frequently hear these workers don't need the money. We hear whether they're teens or older folks, people think they're only working for pocket change. But that's also not the case. Our estimates show that for the average impacted worker, their wages make up 36% of their household's income. That's way more than pocket change. So we already know that 86% of the people who would benefit from this proposal aren't teenagers. But we also know that 30% of those who would benefit have a child of their own under 18 in the household. We also know the industries these folks work in. Our data show that these workers who would benefit are disproportionately in retail, educational services, healthcare, social assistance, arts, entertainment, and restaurant jobs. These are our essential workers. These are the workers who have shouldered a disproportionate burden of the pandemic. I highlighted during the session that in the first year of the pandemic, research that looked at mortality risk early during COVID, the first year of the pandemic, the occupation that had the highest COVID mortality risk was line cooks in restaurants. We hear that if we raise the minimum wage, prices will just skyrocket. I've heard someone describe this as a death spiral. If you raise the wage, prices will go up. Your wage doesn't buy as much, then you raise the wage again, prices go up, etc. But labor is far, far from the only thing that factors into the cost of a good or service. And it's really important to remember now, and when most of these questions come up and we get pushback, it's important to remember that Pennsylvania is not the first state to try to raise the minimum wage above $7.25 per hour. We're not blazing a trail here. We can look to the very publicly available data from any state if we want to see what happens to prices or employment. I've personally called up Taco Bells across the country, and I can tell you that a Supreme burrito in Erie County, Pennsylvania is the same price as a Supreme burrito across the border, just a couple miles across the border in New York, even though all New York fast food workers have been being paid a $15 minimum wage since 2021. Research shows that higher wages actually save employers money across several spaces by reducing employee turnover. You don't have as high training costs, and higher wages improve worker productivity and their morale. Here is that a minimum wage increase is going to hurt businesses. We hear this a lot, especially in the context of small business. The fact of the matter is minimum wage increases are spent right back into local economies, and businesses depend on customers who make enough to buy what they're selling. When you raise the minimum wage, you don't have people storing that money in offshore accounts or going on lavish vacations abroad. They're spending it right back into the economy on necessities. There's all sorts of survey research on economic anxiety, focus, health outcomes, and better pay is related to better health outcomes, meaning workers take fewer sick days. One of the first types of spending to increase when workers get raises is dining, an effect that will provide some relief to the struggling restaurant industry. And one of the last myths that we hear, we've heard a lot more lately, is that $15 an hour is just too much. This generally comes from people who agree that the minimum wage needs raised, but they think that $15 is just too much. So Pennsylvania's average living wage is $16.41. So the words living wage are thrown around a lot, but let me tell you a little bit about the context that I am describing it in. According to MIT researchers, the living wage is an hourly amount that is enough to keep that worker off of anti-poverty programs, but would not cover any purchase of prepared foods, eating outside the home. The worker would have $0 for entertainment and $0 for savings. The average living wage for a full-time worker in Pennsylvania overall is currently $16.41 for a single worker with no children. You can take a look at this chart and look what happens when that adult has 1 child, 2 child, 3 children. whether there are 2 adults in the household with one working or 2 adults in the household with both working. So the average living wage for a full-time worker in Pennsylvania with 0 children is currently $16.41. In the past, I've generally referred to this as a subsistence wage. So thinking back to the FDR quote earlier, and by living wages, I mean more than a bare subsistence level. I mean the wages of a decent living. I'm not sure $0 for entertainment or savings. I'm not sure if that's a decent living if you can't absorb the impact of even a small emergency. But generally, when researchers discuss a living wage, it's this one from MIT. The average living wage for a full-time worker in Pennsylvania, again, is $16.41, single worker with no children. So who actually stands to benefit from a $15 per hour minimum wage by January 1st, 2024? Well, we ran the numbers. If Pennsylvania raised the minimum wage to $15 per hour by January 1st, 2024, over 1.5 million Pennsylvania workers would benefit, nearly 1.6. And when I say benefit, I say these are the people that our estimates show would expect to see a wage increase. Of these workers, over 61% are women. Of the workers who would benefit, only 14% are teens. And among the workers who would benefit, 31% of them are people of color. And this is pretty big because the people of color, their working population in Pennsylvania is only around 21% of the Pennsylvania labor force. So they are disproportionately represented in people who would benefit under this proposal. 29% of the people who would benefit are parents to a child under 18 in their household. And over 50% of the people who would benefit work full-time. The average worker who would benefit would expect to see just over a $4,300 raise per year. So that's for full-time work year-round. That's a pretty sizable chunk of change. And again, this isn't money that's spent abroad. With so many Americans living paycheck to paycheck, this money is spent directly back into the economy. So these benefits of who benefits and by how much, these track with every minimum wage proposal we've analyzed. We know that people of color and women are disproportionately clustered in low-wage positions. It's part of the gender and race pay disparities we face in Pennsylvania and as a country. A lot more work is needed, of course, to address those disparities, but a $15 minimum wage is a start. Who exactly stands to benefit hasn't changed. So it's made things tricky for advocates when it comes to messaging in recent years. This next section was presented by Vivian Singara. So it's what's new in messaging. She highlighted, and not much is new. We've been calling for $15 an hour for years. And she asked the room if they knew when organizations started popularly calling for $15 an hour as a living wage. And the Fight for 15 movement celebrated its 10-year anniversary in 2022. Vivian walked us through why $15 is absolutely needed, and some messaging tactics to help break those common myths we discussed before. Messaging that centers who would benefit most, and finally, bringing in a call for ending state preemption on the minimum wage after a $15 statewide minimum wage floor is set. In Vivian's last slide here, she highlighted that while we desperately need a higher minimum wage, there are some ways that we probably shouldn't do it. The case study here shows Michigan's schedule for raising their minimum wage. The current living wage, the hourly wage needed to lift one adult with 0 children off of anti-poverty programs, but to not allow a single dollar for entertainment or savings. The current living wage in Michigan is already $16.27 right now, but their scheduled minimum wage will only hit just over $12 on January 1st, 2031. So ultimately, there's not a lot of fresh messaging on this issue because this isn't a fresh issue. Messaging can also get tricky because Pennsylvania doesn't just have one minimum wage. We have some sub-minimum wages as well. Tipped workers in Pennsylvania get paid $2.83 per hour, a generous 70 cents more than the federal tipped minimum wage. And Pennsylvania is one of 14 states where people with disabilities, intellectual or developmental disabilities, can be paid less than the minimum wage. It's a special certificate program employers can apply for, and the average wage for a person working under one of these certificates is $3.34 per hour. Recently, a bipartisan group of senators, including our own Senator Casey, announced a move to begin phasing out this practice while simultaneously creating supports that encourage the creation of inclusive jobs for people with disabilities. The program will provide states with support to help employers transition to paying competitive, fair wages to people with disabilities while continuing to provide services to these workers, particularly those who need more support in the workplace. But like I said, not every state currently allows working under this certificate. And even regarding the minimum wage, states vary widely in their treatment of even tipped workers as well. So the tipped minimum wage varies by state, and even how they adjust it or change it varies. Sometimes it's a percentage or a set dollar amount lower. In Pennsylvania, it's flat. You can see some examples here of New York, which the tip minimum wage is set to $8.33, or 2/3 of the regular minimum wage, whichever is greater. In New Jersey, where the tipped minimum wage is $5.26, they always set it at $9.87 less than the regular minimum wage. West Virginia does a percentage, where their tipped minimum is set at 30% of the regular minimum, and in Pennsylvania, we're at a flat $2.83 an hour, $2.83 per hour. But there are 7 states, which are called one fair wage states. These 7 states have eliminated their subminimum wage for tipped workers altogether. So tipped workers statewide, earn the same minimum wage as others. The one fair wage states, especially the one fair wage movement, they center how the subminimum wage is just rooted in a legacy of slavery. After emancipation, the restaurant industry wanted Black folks to work for them but didn't want to pay them, forcing them to live on tips. And this concept was made law. Tipped workers struggle with twice the poverty rate of other workers and the highest rates of sexual harassment of any industry, because they have to tolerate inappropriate customer behavior to feed their families in tips. These 7 states see restaurant job and small business growth on par with other states, but also have half the rate of sexual harassment in the restaurant industry. Governor Shapiro's proposal in the budget didn't specify details for tipped workers, so we're looking to bills introduced in the General Assembly for details about the tipped minimum wage and for other items like preemption. Preemption is a legal doctrine that allows a higher level of government to limit or even eliminate the power of a lower level of government to regulate a specific issue. So on the matter of the minimum wage in Pennsylvania, it's used to stop localities from setting their own minimum wages. These are some examples of county differences in the living wage right now. In Center County, for one adult working full-time with 0 children, the living wage needed to lift them off of anti-poverty programs, but again, not have a single dollar for savings or entertainment. That wage is $18.25 per hour. We can see there's some regional differences. If we pop up to Erie County, where that living wage for the same worker is $15.29. And even in Cameron County, one of the least populous, if not the least populous county in Pennsylvania, the living wage is still up there. It's $14.74. And to highlight the need to remove preemption on the issue of the minimum wage after a $15 statewide minimum is set, let's take a look at 2 counties as a case study. We have here Clearfield County and Philadelphia County. In 2021, MIT's living wage for one adult in Clearfield was $12.06. By 2023, it rose to $14.63. So in Philadelphia, in 2021, the living wage for one adult was $14.47, and by 2023, it was $17.53. So both of these changes for these counties from 2021 to 2023 represent a 21% increase. But the dollar change is different. So in Clearfield, it rose $2.57 an hour, and in Philadelphia, it rose $3.06 an hour. So after setting a strong statewide floor of $15 per hour, localities are looking to set their own minimum wages because the cost of living varies greatly within the state. Vivian presented these slides as an interactive component to highlight just how long it's been since the last time the minimum wage was raised. Miley Cyrus released Party in the USA in 2009, the last year the minimum wage was raised. Captain Sully Sullenberger in the Miracle on the Hudson landed the plane on the Hudson River. Farmville was released by Facebook, the game Farmville. Kanye West interrupted Taylor Swift in a very memeable moment at the Video Music Awards. And 2008 was Barack Obama's first inauguration. So what happens when we raise the minimum wage? Most importantly, how do we ensure that we don't have to have this policy fight every few years? Some states haven't decided to tie their minimum wage to any sort of cost of living measure. But many states have led the way and have indexed their minimum wage or tied its value to something. So in Ohio, they decided to look at one measure of inflation from August to August and round that to the nearest 5 cents, tack that on to the minimum wage, and boom, there's your yearly adjustment. Virginia opted to look at a different inflation measure across a calendar year and tack that on to the minimum wage, and there's your yearly adjustment. New Jersey uses the same inflation measure that Ohio does. They just don't round it to the nearest 5 cents. And New York, kind of out there on their own, the director of the Division of Budget consults with the Department of Labor, and they pick something yearly. And there's 10 other ways you could do this, or even more. There's lots of ways you can do this, and not doing it nearly guarantees that Pennsylvanians will be fighting this fight again in the future, which is the last thing that anybody wants. Along with the minimum wage being forever at the front of policy and advocacy in our Commonwealth, some other items have taken the stage in Pennsylvania and nationally again. One of these is youth employment. So the trend for youth employment in recent years in Pennsylvania, there's been a slight uptick of youth employment. Generally speaking, these are people under 17 years of age, as when you hit 18, labor laws are a little bit different. Overall, for Pennsylvania workers 17 and under, their employed numbers ticked slightly up in the last year by about 30,000 workers, according to current population survey data. But this number is still on par with their 2018 and 2019 numbers, so this isn't a huge explosion or anything. The recent increase is likely partly due to general COVID recovery, as well as more opportunity for teens in specific industries and occupations. But as low-paying employers struggle to find workers, the pandemic has spurred a lot of early retirement, people leaving the labor force altogether, people getting promoted, and these jobs are looking for workers. They've begun pretty heavily targeting teens in their hiring, in their ads, and their messaging. And there was reporting from earlier this week showing how specific lobbying groups and a Florida think tank has been behind the recent campaign for states to rewrite their child labor laws. Last week, it was Iowa at 5 o'clock in the morning. Their state Senate approved a bill to allow children as young as 14 to work night shifts and 15-year-olds to work on assembly lines. In March, it was Arkansas eliminating work permits and age verification for workers younger than 16. So there are pros and cons to youth employment. The COVID-19 pandemic shifted the labor force around. People retired, quit, and employers are looking to fill jobs, competing for workers. Young workers can, gain experience and make money, but at the same time, recent policy changes have experts worried that enforcing child labor laws in the name of safety is only going to get harder, and that children are going to get hurt. Child labor laws, like most workplace protections, weren't just written for fun. They're written because people got hurt. because young, sleepy teen drivers being on the road at night isn't great, because school performance suffers when you're working long hours. These are some headlines just in the past 6 months or so of labor violations at Pennsylvania spots. There's a plastic manufacturer, I think it was Titusville, some McDonald's franchise around Pittsburgh, and a couple Dunkin' locations, I think around Hershey and Hummelstown. While these recent violations don't represent a huge uptick, generally child labor violations had been declining for years, but then after 2015 they started climbing back up. And youth, brand new to the labor force, don't always know that they're being taken advantage of, or they might be too scared to speak up. And they're not alone. There are plenty of issues that pop up more in low-wage workplaces that workers find themselves, at the short end of the stick. Another one of these examples is with wage theft. UCLA probably leads U.S. labor research in the U.S., and they put out infographics like these last two here as part of education campaigns. Wage theft is so rarely prosecuted because workers, one, they might not even know they're victims. Two, workers are so dependent on their jobs that they fear retaliation if they report. And even being able to report is costing time and money. And even when they do report it and win a case, they might not ever recover those lost wages. It's also pretty difficult to get a good wage theft estimate for how much is stolen from workers for those same reasons. There are data on caught wage theft and its value, and there are surveys on how often wage theft is reported, when workers actually experience it. So those two data sources together, with some others, help to inform our best wage theft estimates. During the presentation, we did a quick activity where I displayed these U.S. theft estimates courtesy of the 2019 FBI Uniform Crime Statistics. They show robbery and its 2019 cost of around $500 million in the U.S., burglary, $3 billion in 2019, and motor vehicle theft, which amounted to $6 billion. And I asked the room where they thought one of the most rigorous wage theft estimates sits on this chart. I added the bar, discussed how it actually goes off the screen, and then resized the chart to show this. The Economic Policy Institute estimates that across all wage theft types in the U.S., as much as $50 billion a year is stolen from workers. $50 billion. And although a bit dated, here it is adjusted with a proper scale on the chart. And although this number is a bit dated, the value of back wages, just back wages illegally withheld by employers, only $280 million was actually recovered in this year by the Department of Labor. So if we take that $280 million and take it back to this bonkers chart here, the line is actually only half the size of that tiny little robbery bar, around half the size of that tiny little robbery bar. Microsoft PowerPoint wouldn't actually let me draw a line on a bar that was that small. And victims of wage theft, as it happens most in low-wage industries, are the people disproportionately represented in those jobs. Among these mostly service industry workers are women, immigrants, and people of color. So I wrapped up this session with a call, but not just any call, but the first cell phone call, because April 2023, this month, marks the 50th anniversary of the first cell phone call. On April 3rd, 1973, co-inventor Martin Cooper left his Motorola office and headed to Midtown Manhattan to use the first cell phone, that giant brick that he's holding there, to call up his competitor and counterpart at Bell Labs AT&T to brag. That pioneering brick of a phone is just unrecognizable next to today's sleek, lightweight models. The latter with capabilities no one imagined 50 years ago. And at 94 years old, Martin Cooper has lived to see that whole progression. Certainly since the 1970s, but even since the year 2000, tons of goods and services have dropped pretty significantly in prices. Televisions, clothing, computers, and certainly cell phones. The first cell phone, the Motorola Dynatac 8000X, retailed for $12,000 of today's dollars at the time of its release, and it cost 1,193 minimum wage hours at the time. It was 1980 something when it was released. Today, I can pop onto eBay and buy an unused older model of an iPhone for less than $100, or around 14 of today's minimum wage hours. So tons of things have stayed, nearly the same or even dropped significantly in price over time. But not all things. Key necessities like hospital, medical, childcare, higher education, food, drinks, and housing has gone up significantly in price. And more recent upticks in the price of food, new cars, gasoline, and utilities has caused these basics to consume increasingly more of a household's income, leaving many struggling to make ends meet. The peak value of the U.S. minimum wage was 5 years before that historic cell phone call. The value peaked in 1968, where it had a value of, it's probably a little bit more than $12.12 right now, but it was $12.12 in 2022 dollars. That year, 1968, one person working full-time at the federal minimum wage was enough to keep a family of 3 above the poverty line. At today's Pennsylvania federal minimum wage of $7.25 per hour, that same full-time year-round worker earns only $500 over the amount needed to pull one person, just himself, above the poverty line. And that worker would need to work 10-hour days every single day of the year to lift that same family of 3's income just above the poverty line today. The difference in what the minimum wage can do, what people who make the minimum wage can afford and who the minimum wage can support, it's not because our poverty lines have changed. There's less than a $900 difference between the 1968 and 2023 poverty threshold for a family of 3 once you adjust for inflation. The difference between what the 1968 minimum wage could do and what the current minimum wage can do is representative of a failure to answer repeated calls to raise it. As we congratulate this year's high school graduating class, the class of 2023, it's a stark reminder that they were in preschool the last time the minimum wage was raised. Preschool. The call from Pennsylvania workers has long gone unanswered, but the General Assembly has offered bills to raise the minimum wage. At the time of this recording, one so far at $18 per hour and at least one at $15 per hour, the latter of which has made the issue a bit more purple in Pennsylvania politics. We're looking to see if legislators will finally answer the call for at least a $15 statewide minimum wage. Thanks for watching this recap. Because you don't get the opportunity to ask questions in person, I encourage you to reach out to me by email, kovach@keystoneresearch.org, if you'd like to chat about this or other issues impacting Pennsylvanians. Thank you very much.